We got married at 20, both of us still pretty young. About a year later, I decided to go back to school to finish my degree. Shortly after, we became parents, and the pressure to complete my degree grew. Our kid had just turned 2 when I started my final year of college, with only 2 semesters left to go. By September 1993, my days were packed. I worked a part-time job from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. stocking shelves at a store. After that, I had a full-time desk job at the police department from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday nights were reserved for school from 5:30 p.m. to 10 p.m., and I had classes again on Saturdays, starting at 8 a.m. and finishing by 2 p.m. My wife worked as a nurse's aide at the local hospital from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Our little one was taken care of by my mom, which was a huge help. The best part was that everything, school, jobs, and my parents, was all within a 10-minute drive. We had a pretty solid system going, doing our best to make everything work while I pursued my degree. Right before the big day, during the spring of 1994, things between us were rough. It was finals week for me. If I could finish my papers and ace my finals by Sunday, I'd be done with my bachelor's in science and the grueling 8-month stretch of work. But my wife was upset because I wouldn't take a break from studying to take her and the kids out. She'd been complaining about my work and school commitments for a while now, and it had gotten so bad that we hadn't been intimate for 2 months. On that Monday evening, I was going over a research paper I'd finished on Saturday, which was due on Tuesday. Meanwhile, she kept picking fights nonstop. I finally told her to stop being childish. She looked at me and blurted out, "I hate you, and I'm in love with someone else." I was stunned. We argued for about an hour until she finally confessed what had happened earlier that day during her lunch break. She admitted that for the past 2 months she'd been involved emotionally with a janitor from the hospital. It all started with him complimenting her and being around whenever she was nearby. Things escalated to them having lunch together in the cafeteria, and soon they were regularly complaining about me to him. About 2 weeks ago, their complaining sessions moved to his car. She confessed that during that time, they had kissed twice, but today it had gone further. They had a full-on makeout session, which ended with her giving him a handjob while he was touching her, and they both talked about how much they loved each other. When she laid all of that on me, I felt like I was floating outside of reality. It was as if I'd momentarily left this world. I'll get into more about what was going on in my mind that night later, but for now, let me share what my wife wrote about that moment. It was strange. When I told him about what happened, I expected some sort of explosive reaction. Instead, he looked at me with a level of pain that was almost unbearable. Then, it was like he completely shut down. He turned away and quietly walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. I remember feeling a surge of anger. It was as if he wasn't even going to fight for me. At that moment, I felt like I had made the right decision, like everything was finally falling into place. I was breaking free from the guy who'd been neglecting me for months. I grabbed a suitcase and walked back into the living room, passing him and heading straight for the front door. I recall her repeatedly asking where I was going, with one of her comments being that I was running back to my mom. I placed the suitcase down in the driveway, went back inside, grabbed her purse and offered it to her, telling her to leave. She was taken aback and refused to leave, so I gently lifted her onto my shoulder, carried her outside, and set her down on the car hood. Her shock gave me the chance to rush back inside and lock the door. She tried to get in, but I held firm on the deadbolt until she eventually left. She crashed at her parents' place and told them we were separating, though she didn't explain why. It was a brutal night. I called both of my jobs to say that a family emergency had come up and that I wouldn't be in the next day. Eventually, I managed to drift off to sleep. When I woke up at 7, I immediately began planning how to minimize contact with my soon-to-be ex. I called my mom to see if she could look after my son. She was concerned because he usually would have been there by then. Then I made a list of things I needed to tackle that day and got started. First, I dropped off my son and let my mom know we needed to have a serious talk later. After that, I visited the office of a family lawyer who was an old friend of my dad's and someone I'd known for a long time. I told him I wanted to start the divorce process immediately. He listened but suggested I take some time to think it over. However, I was determined. He said he could have the divorce papers ready by the end of the day, and I agreed to come by and pick them up. I planned to file them personally at the clerk's office. Handling these kinds of things was part of my job with the police department. Next, I went out and got new locks for the house, then stopped by the bank. I emptied and closed both our savings and checking accounts, took half the cash, and put it in an envelope. I then went to my sister-in-law's workplace and gave her my wife's share of the money. I told her to pass on a message to my wife, no contact with me whatsoever, and that the money was her portion from the bank. I also informed her that I had canceled our only credit card. Back at my mom's place, I laid everything out for her. She and my younger sister came up with a plan. My sister would stay at my house to look after my son while I juggled work and school for the rest of the week. I headed home, changed the locks, spent the afternoon tidying up and playing with my son, and then went to school. Meanwhile, my wife decided to skip work that day. She contacted the janitor and told him what had happened. He was sympathetic and invited her over to his place that evening to get away from everything. I'll share more details about his place later. In short, she went over and ended up hooking up with him. Here's what she wrote about that night. He fell asleep afterward, and although I was initially excited, things started to feel wrong during and after it happened. With him asleep, my thoughts wandered, and I began to reflect on how G, that's me, had kind of pushed her into this situation and made her seek someone else. I got up and left, and on the drive home, memories of the first time G and I had sex came rushing back. We were each other's first, and it hit me hard. I was overwhelmed with self-loathing and felt utterly disgusted with myself. The anger quickly shifted back to G, and I found myself trapped in a twisted cycle of blame. I couldn't face the reality of how badly I had messed up, so I convinced myself it was all his fault. The day started off like any other. I went to work, then returned home, showered, and had breakfast with my son and sister. My wife called, wanting to discuss plans for seeing our son. Her tone was arrogant and spiteful. I told her I'd meet her on Sunday at 1 p.m., and she could spend time with him at a nearby park. She wasn't happy with that arrangement and pushed for a whole weekend with him. I put my foot down, and she realized that if he stayed at the house, it solved her babysitting problem. With both her parents working, she didn't press the issue further and hung up abruptly. I went to work at the police department and, as soon as I could, I went by the clerk's office to file the divorce papers. Later that day, a woman I knew from the office gave me a heads up that the papers were ready. I headed over to the sheriff's office to get them served. I called a deputy I was familiar with and explained the situation, asking him to serve the papers to her while she was at work. He agreed and said he'd handle it the next day. Meanwhile, my soon-to-be ex got back to work. Her janitor friend dropped by and talked to her throughout the day. They couldn't meet up for lunch or in the evening because he claimed he had a commitment with one of his kids. He had told my wife earlier in their affair that he was divorced and had 3 kids. After work, she went to her parents' place. Later that night, she called me 3 times, and each time I hung up as soon as I saw her number on the caller ID, which wasn't all that common back then. After another night of intense grieving, my day began just like the previous one. I went to work and, upon arriving at my second job, received a call from the deputy assigned to serve the divorce papers. He said he'd be there around noon, which worked for me since her lunch break was from 11 a.m. to noon. I tried to focus on work while sitting at my desk, but I was restless, getting up and heading to the bathroom several times before eventually throwing up. I had to keep talking myself down and reminding myself that I was doing the right thing. Fortunately, my wife hadn't contacted me so far. At 11 a.m., my wife met up with the janitor for lunch. They slipped away to his car in the parking lot and engaged in some intimate activity. Really classy. Afterward, they cleaned up and went back inside to grab some food from the cafeteria. At noon, my wife returned to the nurse's station on her hall, accompanied by the janitor. They struck up a conversation with the RN in charge of the hall. Just 5 minutes later, the deputy walked in. He asked the RN about Kay, my wife, and she spoke up saying, "That's me." The deputy turned to her and in a loud voice announced, "Mrs. K, you're being sued for divorce due to infidelity." My wife collapsed onto the floor. Here's how she described that moment. When I heard that, an overwhelming wave of shame and guilt hit me. It sunk in that I had destroyed my marriage and that this was really happening. I was actually going to be divorced. Part of me naively believed he wouldn't go through with it and thought this was just another argument where I'd end up coming out on top. It was some messed up thinking. I remember the deputy physically lifting me and making me sit in a chair. There was screaming, coming from me, and the RN was trying to calm me down. The janitor reached for my hand, and in a moment of rage, I ended up punching him. My punch landed on his neck as he turned his head, and I scratched him as he tried to pull away. I was shouting at him, furious about how he had ruined my life. Eventually, they managed to calm me down. The deputy mentioned that the janitor had left right away, and my wife managed to compose herself and return to her shift, although she was covered for by a lot of people. At 2:45 p.m., as my wife was nearing the end of her shift, she was summoned to the hospital administrator's office. Fear gripped her as she worried that someone must have reported her earlier meltdown. When she walked in, the administrator shut the door and immediately told her she was fired. She was instructed not to return to the premises, and her final paycheck would be sent by mail. It turned out that someone had witnessed the rendezvous in the parking lot and reported it. At some point, I had been brought in and shared the story about the divorce papers. The janitor was questioned, fired, and kicked off the premises just an hour before my wife lost her job. Word had spread throughout the hospital, and she mentioned she just got into her car and drove over to her parents' place. At that point, her folks still didn't know the full story, only that we had split up, and things seemed quite serious. At 5:30 p.m., I was having dinner with my son at home. My sister had gone out with her friends, so it was just the two of us. The deputy had filled me in on the events of the day, and it was oddly satisfying to know the impact of what had transpired. It was just luck that the janitor happened to be there, and I was surprised my wife hadn't been arrested for hitting him. But well, you can't have everything. Then there was a knock at the door. When I answered, there stood a woman who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall and was heavily pregnant, barely able to stand upright. She asked for Kay. I told her that she no longer lived here and wasn't coming back. She inquired if I was her husband, and I replied that I was her soon-to-be ex-husband and that I had served her the divorce papers earlier that day. She introduced herself as Dee, the janitor's wife, and revealed that she was carrying their 4th child. I invited her in and offered her a seat as she explained what had happened earlier, about her husband's involvement with my wife, the firing, and the whole messy situation. I was on the verge of throwing up. Who had I married? This woman was completely out of her mind. Dee also filled me in on the house where my wife had been meeting the janitor. At that moment, if I could have laid hands on him, I would have done so without a second thought. Not for my wife's sake, but for the sake of decency. This guy was scum, plain and simple. I'll get into more about the house later. Dee asked where my wife was, and I told her she was with her parents. She assured me she just wanted to talk to my wife and reveal the whole truth. I gave her directions, and as my son sat at the table, visible from the living room, Dee praised me for being a great father handling everything on my own. Then she got up and left. By 6:30 p.m., my father-in-law answered the door to find Dee standing there. She wanted to speak with my wife. Assuming she was one of Kay's friends, he fetched her. Kay stepped out onto the porch to talk with Dee. Dee introduced herself and informed Kay that she needed to understand the full truth about her affair with the janitor. It turned out that Dee and the janitor were still married and living together. Dee was 8 months pregnant with their 4th child. Kay was already in a state of distress, tears streaming down her face as she repeatedly apologized. But the situation was about to get even worse. You see, the janitor and another guy at the hospital, along with a friend, were part of a sick game. Their aim was to see how many married women they could seduce in 90 days. Before my wife, the third guy had managed 3 conquests. My wife had become the janitor's third, and that night he had supposedly been busy with one of his kids. He was actually with a 4th woman. Dee revealed that this woman was married for 25 years and that she planned to tell her husband. To make matters worse, this woman turned out to be their neighbor. As for the house, it was a place they rented specifically for their illicit meetings. Dee discovered this just 2 hours after the janitor was fired. He came home high and sobbing, confessing everything in a desperate bid to fix things. Dee, unable to tolerate any more, took the kids and left, telling my wife she was done with him. Dee squared her shoulders and slapped my wife hard across the face, calling her a dumb cow. Kay was stunned into silence. Dee then told her she should be ashamed of herself for throwing away her family. She recounted how she had been at our place just an hour earlier, watching me, a loving father, care for our son all alone because his wife was a selfish, thoughtless witch. My wife completely lost it, breaking down into uncontrollable tears as Dee walked away. Dee got into her car and drove off, leaving my wife in utter chaos. My in-laws, hearing the car pull away, rushed to check on her. She was almost in a trance, so they brought her inside and debated taking her to the ER when she started speaking erratically. My father-in-law suspected she might be on some kind of stimulant. She rambled about how terrible she was and how she needed to make things right. After a while, they managed to calm her down and she eventually gave them the full story. My father-in-law was deeply wounded. He's always been a good man, and my wife could see the profound shame and disappointment on his face. As for my mother-in-law, she fell back on her usual pattern and blamed me for everything. To be honest, I wasn't too fond of her at that moment. The next day, my father-in-law called me to apologize. It was the only time I ever saw a hint of tears in his eyes. He updated me on what had happened and said Kay had been holed up in her room, barely coming out. I reminded him about the appointment I had set up for Sunday at 1 p.m. at the park. He agreed and then hung up. I worked on Friday and attended school on Saturday. By the end of the day, I received the news that I had passed and would be receiving my degree. It was a whirlwind of emotions, but I had made it. My parents celebrated with a barbecue that night, inviting extended family over. I'm grateful for my supportive family. Nobody mentioned Kay. The following day at 1 p.m., Kay didn't show up as planned. I took it as a stroke of luck, something that could work in my favor if a custody battle came up. At 3:30 p.m., her father called me. He told me that Kay was still in a state of disarray, wandering around in her bathrobe with a notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She hadn't bathed in days and was barely eating. He was worried, sick, and exhausted, even fearful that she might harm herself. He begged me to come see her. I turned him down. I couldn't summon any feelings for her. I told him to get her professional help and that I'd consider allowing her to see our son once she was in a better place. Truthfully, I felt nothing for her. That first night had tested me beyond measure, but I came out stronger. I wasn't going to invest any more care or concern into her. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't hear from her or her family. A couple of weeks had passed since that conversation with my father-in-law. During this time, I had quit my part-time job and was actively searching for a new one. My plans for an MBA were on hold until I settled into a new position. My son had been asking about his mother, and all I could do was offer him vague reassurances. The longer she delayed reaching out, the better it might be for my chances of securing a favorable custody arrangement. I was at the police department when she called, wanting to set up a time to meet and see our son. I asked if she had managed to pull herself together enough not to frighten him, and she assured me she had. We arranged to meet at 9 a.m. in the park on Saturday. I also asked her to bring her father along. I didn't want to meet her alone. My mother came with me for support. When I saw her, I was certain I had made the right decision to limit her contact to just 2 hours. She looked terrible, noticeably thinner, with no makeup, and smelling faintly of ivory soap. She didn't have any of the familiar scents or appearance I used to associate with her. I later learned that her mother had bathed and dressed her. Kay clearly wasn't fully functional yet. Our park meetings continued for about 3 weeks, and eventually I extended them to 4 hours, including Sundays. Each week, Kay's appearance improved, but I remained deeply concerned about her mental well-being. As a result, I refused to let our son stay overnight with her or see him alone. Eventually, my mother-in-law grew frustrated with this arrangement and decided to hire a lawyer to file for custody. Kay hadn't signed the divorce papers yet, but that was fine with me. I could file for divorce through the court after 6 months anyway. However, the custody lawsuit infuriated me, especially since she was aiming for full custody. I had already discussed with Kay's father that I was open to eventually working toward a 50-50th custody split, but her mother's actions had thrown that possibility out the window. In response, I countered with a request for full custody based on Kay's mental state. I was itching for a confrontation. I was furious and needed a way to release that pent-up anger, and this was my chance. On the day of the custody hearing, my lawyer informed me that Kay's attorney had approached him with a request. Kay wanted to speak with me privately. Initially, I refused, but my lawyer suggested it might be an offer to settle, so I reluctantly agreed, insisting that the conversation take place in the hallway outside the courtroom, where both attorneys could witness, but not overhear. Kay started with small talk, asking about our son and how he was doing. I replied that he was great and improving daily. She then asked about my schooling, and I told her that I had passed and would be graduating next week. She seemed genuinely pleased with that. Then she looked down and asked if she could attend my graduation. I told her that the graduation was meant for my family and friends, and since she was neither, the answer was no. That response hit her hard. Throughout most of our relationship, we had worked together to achieve that goal, and by saying no, I was denying her the chance to share in that accomplishment with me. She pleaded, but I held my ground. I added, "It's special to me. It didn't matter enough to you when you let someone else treat you like garbage." I was letting my anger fuel my responses, and it felt good to finally assert myself, even if it was through causing her pain. She welled up with tears, turned around, and walked back to her lawyer. The hearing commenced, and I testified, sticking to the facts without revealing any additional details. Then my mother-in-law stood up and laid the blame squarely on me. She claimed that I was seeing someone and driving my wife insane. There was no evidence for this, but the truth was irrelevant to her. She also alleged that I had assaulted Kay by grabbing her and throwing her onto the car hood the night she left. Next, it was Kay's turn. She began answering her attorney's questions but stopped after the third one. She asked the judge if she could speak directly, and although the judge suggested she consult her attorney first, she declined. He granted her permission. In her notebook, Kay wrote, "I remember feeling so sad as the hearing started. I listened to G presenting his side of the story, and how he'd taken care of Jay, our son, all these weeks. I knew I needed to make things right. Sitting there, I knew my mom was lying to protect me, but it was just one more lie on top of another. I'd had enough. I had to fix this." Kay then turned to the room and apologized to my parents, who were present. She also expressed remorse to her own parents. Looking at me, she acknowledged that I probably hated her more than anyone else right now. She admitted that everything that had happened was her fault, and that, at this point, she just wanted to salvage whatever was left of our shared history, even if it was just to reach a point where I could look at her without disgust. She then addressed the judge and expressed her desire to retract her previous claims, stating that she would accept any custody arrangement I deemed appropriate. After conferring with my attorney, we proposed a plan for supervised 1-hour visits for 6 weeks, followed by every other weekend if everything went smoothly. The judge agreed, and we adjourned. In hindsight, that moment gave me a small glimpse of potential for us to be more civil to each other. Not a reconciliation, but at least a sense of mutual respect. The visitation routine settled into a rhythm. By the third week, our time together stretched to 3 or 4 hours each visit. Just Kay, me, and our son. Although I kept my distance, I appreciated seeing my son bond with his mother. It was good for him, and I hoped it would be beneficial for Kay too. However, during the 5th visit, there was an incident. As I watched our son play, Kay unexpectedly hugged my arm from behind. The sudden touch made me panic, and I shouted at her to never touch me again. She quickly embraced our son, then hurriedly left. The following week, we acted like the incident never happened, and she kept her distance. Over the next month, we began discussing daily matters more frequently. I had landed a new job with better pay, and Kay had started nursing school. During this time, she told me the janitor continued to harass her. She claimed she wanted to be upfront in case I heard about it from someone else. Despite asking him to stop, he kept showing up at her parents' house, even prompting her father-in-law to threaten him if he didn't back off. I told her I didn't care about her current affairs and was only focused on moving forward. Kay insisted she was no longer involved with anyone and wouldn't be until she was sure our family was beyond repair. I made it clear that I believed it was beyond saving. 6 months after we separated, I broached the topic of her signing the divorce papers again. She refused. I reminded her that while I didn't necessarily need her signature, it would simplify things if she cooperated. She suggested coming over that night to discuss the matter, and said she would sign the papers if I still wanted a divorce. I agreed. When she arrived, she brought several black composition notebooks. She told me she had started writing in them the day after she received the divorce papers. She didn't fully understand why, but it seemed to help her find some peace. She had meticulously recorded every detail she could remember about what happened, delving into every interaction with the janitor. She wanted me to read them, though she warned that it would be painful. In those notebooks, she detailed everything about her relationship with the janitor, the conversations, the encounters, and everything in between. I wasn't thrilled about reading Kay's notebooks, but she was insistent. She knew it was a gamble, but she wanted me to understand why she was so determined to salvage our marriage. Reluctantly, I took on the task. She was right. It was tough. While the physical details weren't explicitly described, the way she spoke about me and our marriage in front of the janitor was painfully raw. The account was filled with chaos and disorder, reflecting her emotional turmoil. Over time, her writing became more structured. She began analyzing her actions and words as a form of self-therapy. One peculiar part was her belief that if she didn't reach orgasm with the janitor, it meant she hadn't enjoyed it and thus hadn't done anything wrong. She clung to this misguided notion until she shared it with her father, who, to his discomfort, pointed out that it didn't work that way. Reading her account didn't change my decision, but it did heighten my concerns about her mental state. The fragility of her mindset became starkly clear to me. Despite this, I agreed to give it more time, partly out of apprehension. Her newfound resolve led her to ask me to write a letter detailing my perspective on what had happened. She believed it would help her understand how to support me better. I was still in a chaotic state, but I considered the idea. Maybe putting my thoughts in writing could help me move forward, and perhaps foster a healthier relationship in the future. What Kay referred to as her writing therapy gradually became our method for communication. We committed to meeting twice a week, where our primary task was to document our views on the state of our marriage before and after the infidelity. During these meetings, we exchanged letters and took notes, then posed our questions to each other in writing. We discussed each question thoroughly before moving on to the next, aiming to understand and address our issues more deeply. If we didn't finish everything during a session, we'd pick it up next time. The rules were clear. Be honest, avoid yelling, and don't dodge any questions. Our process began with an evaluation of our relationship before the infidelity, and we moved through each day up to the Sunday after she received the divorce papers. We planned to reassess and adapt as needed. I have to admit, I wasn't always fair during this process. I answered all the questions truthfully, except for one, which I'll address later. But I also used this as a chance to make her relive the hurtful things she'd said about me. I pushed her to detail the physical encounters with the janitor, and though she hesitated, she eventually complied. It was less graphic than what we'd shared, but it still hurt. I thought I could handle it because I wasn't interested in rekindling our relationship. Yet hearing those details was painful. It's incredible how much bitterness I harbored, even though I felt it was justified at the time. About a month into this process, I had to admit it was somewhat beneficial for me. Kay suggested moving back in and trying to work things out, but I declined. Despite her compelling arguments, I remained firm. Even if reconciliation were an option, the idea of being intimate with her again was unimaginable. She accepted this, and even proposed that I seek companionship elsewhere while she remained faithful. That arrangement wasn't something I was comfortable with, so I turned it down. After another month, I finally agreed to let her move back in, but only under strict conditions. Separate rooms. She had to sleep in the spare room. No physical contact. Absolutely no physical contact of any kind. Finances. She would keep her money in her own account, but I would manage her banking. I'd provide checks for bills, rent for the room, and a bit of spending money. This was because she had previously given the janitor $300 from our savings a week before the infidelity came to light. Mother's exclusion. Her mother was not allowed in my home unless we decided to reconcile. I was still angry with her and needed to maintain that boundary. Custody agreement. If we didn't reconcile, all previous custody agreements would automatically resume. New relationships. If I started seeing someone else, she'd have a week to find somewhere else to live. She agreed to these terms and moved back in. It was more challenging than I expected. There was no longer a cooling-off period between our encounters. She was there all the time. I found myself picking fights over trivial matters and making hurtful remarks. I wanted her out almost as soon as she arrived. To address ongoing issues, we introduced what we called Thursday night fight night. This concept stemmed from our meetings where we had been writing down our grievances. Every Thursday night after our child was asleep, we'd sit down and discuss any issues or arguments. Everything had to be resolved that night, with no carryover. This practice eventually evolved into simply asking during dinner if there was anything that needed to be discussed that night. The kids never knew where it came from or its origin. Despite the effort, I was still difficult. I threw her affair in her face at every opportunity. She handled it with surprising calmness and avoided escalating conflicts. In retrospect, I can see that I was emotionally abusive towards her. Yet she remained steadfast, believing we were meant to be together. She felt that since she had caused so much damage, she had to rebuild our life on her own, hoping I would eventually come around and see things her way. She remained dedicated to giving me the time I needed. 6 months after she moved back in, I had my own breakthrough. After a particularly tough day filled with constant triggers, I locked myself in the bedroom, overwhelmed and unable to cope. My wife knocked softly on the door saying, "You need to talk. I'll be out here whenever you're ready." I heard her sit down outside the door, leaning against it. She stayed there for an hour, until nearly midnight, when I finally opened the door. She asked if she could come in, but I suggested we move to her room instead. We sat together, her on the bed and me in a chair. For the first time, I began to open up about what had happened after I asked her to leave on the night I discovered the affair. Let's rewind to that evening D-Day. After she drove away, I spent a long time in our son's room, watching him sleep. I went to my desk, grabbed the checkbook and bill ledger, and placed them along with a copy of the life insurance policy on the kitchen table. Then I took a shower and went to the bedroom, retrieving my gun from the closet shelf and placing it on the bed. I dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt, even tucking in my shirt tail. I combed my hair and sat on the bed, holding the barrel of the gun in my mouth. I was strangely fixated on the taste and smell of the oil on it. It tasted exactly as it smelled. I have no idea how long I sat there. Eventually, I unloaded the gun, put it away, undressed, and went to bed. Unfortunately, I think many betrayed spouses have dark thoughts like this at some point. I told her that was one thing I hadn't shared during our recovery. For the first time, I allowed her to hug me and kiss me on the forehead, not as a farewell, but in a different, more intimate way. It was the first emotional connection I had permitted. I confessed that I had forgiven her that night, even though I didn't truly mean it. It took months for me to genuinely forgive her, but saying those words opened a door for me. Over time, physical touch became more frequent, holding hands, quick kisses, and hugs, all of which gradually became a regular part of our interactions. Although we didn't immediately become intimate, our journey toward reconnection eventually led us there. Nearly a year after she moved back in, we re-established physical intimacy. I think of that period as one of intense emotional repair. According to her, we were intimate 32 times over 28 days. She confided years later that until then, every morning she woke up fearing it might be our last day together. She kept telling herself to hold on just one more day, understanding that our renewed intimacy was a sign of emotional reconnection. Now, our marriage is strong. We've both advanced in our careers and raised 3 grown children who remain unaware of the past. We don't plan to share this with them, but we won't lie if they ask. The experience has brought significant changes in both of us. My wife has grown much stronger and wiser, viewing the ordeal as an unnecessary hardship she ultimately overcame. I sometimes think she still holds herself accountable for the past. We haven't discussed or argued about this issue in over 20 years. She's become highly perceptive and can sense when I'm triggered, which happens occasionally, maybe once or twice a year. These moments are brief but still painful. Her response is always supportive. She holds my hand, hugs me, and reassures me with words of love. I've become more guarded with my emotions and tend to manage them privately. While I offer her emotional support, I've made it clear that I can no longer be her sole emotional crutch. It's her responsibility to express her needs and propose solutions, which I'll help with. Learning to love her again was a gradual process. Our relationship is now different, more grounded but still deeply meaningful. As I've mentioned, giving up some of my emotional openness was a necessary sacrifice for her personal growth. I'm at peace with that now. I hope that by sharing our story, I can offer some guidance to others in similar situations. Every situation is unique, and what worked for us might not work for everyone. I'm not suggesting that reconciliation is always the answer, but rather that focusing on self-care and controlling what you can is crucial. Prioritize what benefits you in your situation. It's okay to be a bit selfish at times. Once you've addressed your own needs, consider working toward a united front in your relationship or marriage, if that's feasible. Reflect on the Serenity Prayer. Its words hold deep truth. Remember, this forum often highlights the darkest days of our lives and marriages. Despite the tragedy we faced, we've built countless joyful memories that far surpass the pain. I wish you all the best on this journey. You can emerge victorious on the other side of pain if you invest in yourself. Update. It's surprising how much time has passed since I first posted here. I took a break from this account after receiving a lot of negative feedback from people strongly opposed to reconciliation. I understand their perspective. Reconciliation is tough, challenging, and painful. However, if it can work under the right circumstances, it has its own rewards. I want to update everyone that we're still together and have become grandparents. For those who've experienced it, you know it's a different kind of love altogether. My wife is now partially retired and works PRN as needed and desired, while I continue working full-time. Despite our busy schedules, we make time for traveling and enjoying life. I can't recall the last time I had a trigger, maybe around 3 years ago. It occurred when our oldest child learned about my wife's affair from a spiteful relative. My wife handled the situation with grace and humility, which helped me move on completely. She apologized for the pain she caused, and we both agreed that it was in the past. If our child had issues with it, we would support him, but it remained our private matter. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to have negatively affected their relationship, though it did cause my wife some embarrassment. That's all I have to share. To those navigating similar pain, I wish you the best. Update. 6 years later, I have some sad news to share about me and my family. Just 3 weeks ago, my former wife passed away. She battled colon cancer for 6 months and left us surrounded by family in the home we had planned to enjoy in retirement. The loss is profound, unlike anything I've ever experienced. It's a different kind of pain from what we felt as betrayed loved ones in those early years after our reconciliation. In those years, she worked hard to make amends for the hurt she had caused, and she succeeded in many ways. I miss her deeply, and so do our kids. But there's something I want to share. In her final days, she wrote a letter to me. She asked our pastor to give it to me after the funeral when he thought it was appropriate. I read it 3 days ago, and I want to share a part of it with you, those who have followed our story and found something positive in it. Her words illustrate how crucial it is for both the betrayed to forgive and for those who have wronged to face the consequences, even when they are truly sorry. Right now, I'm in a lot of physical pain, but my faith helps me find a glimmer of hope and eases the burden a bit. Pain can make you turn inward, and in these past weeks, I've done a lot of soul searching. Sometimes I feel like I deserve this pain because of what I did to you and what we went through years ago. Yet, you have been there for me. You lift me up, help me sit in my chair, feed me, bathe me, hold my hand, and play your guitar as I lose myself in memories. It's clear to me now that this pain is a gift, a way for me to experience the purest form of love, your real forgiveness. Only true love and forgiveness manifest in the actions of those who care for you. I love you so much. Thank you.